March 10, 1942. The waters north of New Britain shimmer under the morning sun, calm and silent, except for the distant rumble of engines high above the clouds. 16 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses are crossing the sky at 25,000 feet, their silver wings catching the light like mirrors of fire. Below them, 8 Japanese transport ships and 4 destroyers cut a straight path through the Bismarck Sea, confident, disciplined, and unaware that they are being watched. On the bridge of his flagship, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura adjusts his binoculars. The horizon is clear, the sea obedient. To him, the threat of high-altitude bombers is laughable. No aircraft flying that high can hit a moving ship. His officers agree. They have seen the clumsy attempts of American bombers before bombs splashing harmlessly hundreds of meters away. But this morning will not be like any other morning. The lead B-17 call sign, Skull 42 banks gently into position. Inside the cockpit, Captain William Saunders checks the drift indicator sweat collecting beneath his oxygen mask, despite the freezing temperature. Behind him, in the transparent nose of the aircraft, the bombardier adjusts a strange, gyro-stabilized device that looks more like a scientific instrument than a weapon. It is the Norden bomb sight, the most secret mechanical computer of the war designed to calculate with mathematical precision the exact point where a bomb must fall to strike a target moving across the sea. Through its glass lenses, the world turns into numbers: altitude, wind, speed, ground, velocity, target drift. When those numbers align, the crosshair becomes destiny. The American crews have been briefed that morning by General George Kenney himself. Their orders are simple: destroy the convoy at any cost. No torpedoes, no low-level runs, only pure calculation and gravity. For months, the U.S. Army Air Forces have been ridiculed by the Japanese Navy. Flying fortresses cannot hit ships, the Tokyo newspapers declare. They are weapons for propaganda, not war. The men inside the B-17s intend to erase that sentence from history in one strike. At 9:27 a.m., the formation begins its attack run. 16 bombers line up in perfect formation 4 miles long, moving at 240 miles per hour. Each carries 10 500-pound demolition bombs fitted with delayed fuses. The bombardiers peer through their Norden sights, adjusting knobs with surgeon-like precision. The interphone crackles, target in sight, steady, bombs away. One by one, the bomb doors open, and black cylinders fall silently into the thin air. For the next 40 seconds, there is only the sound of engines and the faint ticking of the bomb sight gyros. Then from below comes the first flash. On the destroyer, Arashio lookouts scream warnings. The Japanese gunners swing their 25mm cannons upward, firing blindly into the sky. But the B-17s are too high beyond range. The bombs fall through layers of cloud, accelerating to 900 feet per second, invisible until they strike. The first detonation lifts a column of water and flame higher than the ship's mast. The second hits squarely, amidships, tearing through the deck into the ammunition magazine. The explosion turns steel into vapor. Within seconds, black smoke curls upward like a signal to heaven. From 25,000 feet, the American pilots watch the convoy scatter ships, turning desperately, leaving white wakes that look like scratches across blue glass. Captain Saunders steadies his aircraft for a second run. Below him, another transport erupts in fire as its cargo of fuel drums ignites. He watches tiny figures running across the deck before disappearing into the flames. His co-pilot whispers almost to himself, "We actually hit them. We really hit them." Saunders doesn't answer. He's staring at the sight of entire ships burning beneath a single row of bombs. For years, naval officers had claimed this was impossible. For the first time, the impossible is happening in front of human eyes. At sea level, Admiral Kimura can hardly breathe. Every doctrine he has trusted, every calculation of naval supremacy, is collapsing in minutes. The sky, once his ally, once merely a backdrop to the Empire's glory, has turned against him. What he sees above is not just aircraft, it is the machinery of a new kind of warfare. The era of battleships is dying before it even realizes it has grown old. By 9:45, 5 Japanese ships are burning. The air smells of oil and cordite. The sea itself is on fire, black smoke merging with the clouds above. A single American bomber has been hit, limping southward, trailing smoke, but it is still flying. The Japanese gunners continue firing, but their rounds vanish into empty sky. When the attack ends, the silence is unbearable. Kimura lowers his binoculars and says nothing. Around him, the surviving ships pick up survivors, most covered in oil and burns. The convoy that had symbolized Japan's control of the Pacific now drifts in ruins. In less than 20 minutes, 16 aircraft from a single base have done what entire surface fleets failed to accomplish in months. Narration slows. It was the day the sky sank the sea. Viewers are left staring into the image of burning ships, fading beneath rising smoke. The narrator's voice returns quiet, deliberate, certain the Japanese Navy had believed mathematics could not kill. But on that morning, the Americans proved that precision itself had become a weapon. For the Imperial Japanese Navy in early 1942, control of the Pacific seemed permanent. Their fleets ruled the sea lanes from the Philippines to New Guinea. Their carriers had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor, and their destroyers moved through the night like predators. The Pacific, they believed, belonged to them by divine right and superior seamanship. Naval doctrine, perfected through decades of exercises and victories, declared that the ocean could only be conquered by ships. Aircraft might wound a fleet, but they could never destroy one outright. Bombers in the Japanese mind were clumsy birds of the land, far removed from the elemental domain of the sea. Every principle of Japanese naval thinking began with that conviction. Surface vessels, especially destroyers and cruisers, would shield transports, deliver troops and project power across the empire's islands. Their anti-aircraft gunnery was refined, disciplined, and deadly at low altitudes. Their crews drilled to shoot down torpedo bombers or dive bombers that dared to descend into range. But high-altitude bombers, they were a nuisance at best, a waste of resources. When American flying fortresses first appeared in the Southwest Pacific, Japanese officers laughed. They had watched those same aircraft miss targets on land by hundreds of meters. Against ships which moved unpredictably and left no stationary mark, the idea of success seemed absurd. The laughter was echoed across intelligence reports. Japanese analysts recorded that the average American high-altitude bombing accuracy against shipping was less than 2%. The enemy lacks the ability to strike naval targets, one report concluded. Their machines are large but blind. Pilots of the Imperial Navy repeated the same phrase to each other: flying fortresses cannot hit ships. That belief became a shield of arrogance, protecting tradition from the reality of change. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States Army Air Forces were fighting a different kind of war, one not against ships, but against disbelief. In dusty airfields from Hawaii to Queensland, young engineers and pilots tested new ways to hit what should have been impossible targets. Among them was a device that few, even within the military, understood completely: the Norden bombsight. Created by Dutch engineer Carl Norden, this mechanical analog computer transformed bombing from guesswork into mathematics. It calculated angles, wind drift, and velocity with a precision that bordered on science fiction for its time. Its inventor claimed that, with proper use, a bombardier could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The U.S. Army Air Forces knew this claim was exaggerated, but they also knew it contained a dangerous truth: the Norden could make bombing accurate enough to change strategy. The challenge was to prove it in combat. General George Kenney, newly assigned to command the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, understood both the opportunity and the skepticism. His superiors in Washington doubted that B-17s could ever succeed at sea. Bombing ships from altitude 1, Admiral scoffed, is like trying to throw a stone into a bucket from a mountain. Kenney disagreed. He believed that technology properly used could defeat even the strongest navy. While Japan relied on tradition, the Americans turned to innovation. They studied the problem like engineers, not warriors. The ocean, they realized, was not just a battlefield, it was a geometry problem. Ships moved along predictable courses, weather followed measurable patterns, and gravity obeyed no nation. If mathematics could be tamed, then the sea itself could be targeted. The crews of the 19th and 43rd Bombardment Groups began intensive training in high-altitude precision attacks. Day after day, they flew over the coast of Australia, dropping practice bombs on moving barges, refining their calculations, and adjusting their bomb sights. Still, the early results were discouraging. The first attempts missed by hundreds of yards. The bomb sight required perfect data, wind speed, altitude, air density, and even a small error could mean failure. Kenney's men refused to give up. Mechanics modified the bomb racks for smoother release bombardiers, memorized formulas for drift correction, and meteorologists gathered daily reports to feed into the Norden's gears. Gradually, accuracy improved. By February 1942, training exercises showed that well-drilled crews could achieve hits within 50 yards of a target enough to cripple a ship. In Tokyo, Japanese admirals remained unaware that the Americans were rewriting the rules. Their focus stayed on the coming offensives in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Convoys carried men and material to reinforce Leh and Salamaua, confident that American aircraft could harass but not halt them. Each convoy was a small empire in motion, destroyers flanking the transport's lookouts, scanning the horizon, anti-aircraft guns manned day and night. Yet every voyage stretched Japan's resources thinner. Every ship that sailed carried not just soldiers, but the empire's faith in invincibility. When reports arrived that B-17s had begun operating out of Port Moresby, Japanese officers dismissed them. "Let them come," one captain said. "They will miss as always." They did not know that the men of the 43rd Bombardment Group had spent months preparing for this exact mission, studying tides, cloud layers, and the behavior of Japanese ships. Each bombardier had memorized the fall curves for different bomb weights at specific altitudes. Each pilot had practiced formation, flying until the pattern looked more like a machine than a squadron. The Americans were turning war into an equation, and the equation was nearly solved. In the final briefings before the March mission, General Kenney spoke to his crews plainly. "You are going to show them what an American machine can do," he said. "They think you can't hit a ship from the sky. Prove them wrong." The men nodded. Many of them were barely 20 years old. Few had ever seen a Japanese ship. None yet understood that their mission would become one of the turning points of air warfare. Back across the sea in Rabal's naval headquarters, Admiral Kimura finalized his orders for the Leh convoy. 8 transports loaded with troops and supplies would sail under destroyer escort. Weather forecasts were favorable, and the skies were expected to remain clear. He had no reason to believe the enemy could find him, much less destroy him. The Imperial Navy had fought too many battles mastered, too many tactics to fear unproven technology. That night, as Kimura's fleet slipped out of harbor under a moonless sky, the stars above shimmered faintly. To his men, they were symbols of divine protection. To the Americans assembling hundreds of miles away, those same stars were coordinates markers for a target that would soon burn beneath them. By the time dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea, 2 worlds were on a collision course, one ruled by tradition, the other by technology. One believed in gunners and gongs, the other in gyroscopes and gears. The question was no longer whether a bomb could hit a ship, it was whether an empire built on old faith could survive a century defined by machines. The transformation of the flying fortress from a blunt instrument into a scalpel of destruction did not happen in laboratories or lecture halls. It happened in the heat dust and sweat of makeshift airfields across northern Australia, where engineers worked beneath palm trees and pilots practiced in skies so bright they could barely keep their eyes open. In early 1942, the 43rd Bombardment Group operated out of primitive bases like Mariba and Charters Towers, corrugated steel huts surrounded by mud and mosquitoes. Spare parts were scarce tools improvised, and every flight risked engine failure or worse. Yet in those conditions, American mechanics and scientists fused their knowledge into something new, a flying equation of death and precision. And the key lay in understanding that the B-17 was not just a bomber, it was a machine of systems, every dial, cable, and valve connected to something else, and each had to perform perfectly for the Norden bombsight to fulfill its promise. The bombsight itself, a compact cylinder of brass glass and gyroscopes, looked deceptively simple. Inside, however, were more than 2,000 precision-engineered parts. It could calculate true airspeed drift angle and bomb trajectory in real time. The bombardier crouched in the transparent nose of the aircraft would input data by hand: wind direction, altitude, target course, and the device would mechanically compute the exact release moment. Once set, the Norden could even control the aircraft's autopilot, turning the bomber into a self-guided gun platform for a few final seconds before release. To most of the men who used it, the Norden was part miracle, part mystery. They called it the brain, and they treated it like a sacred object. When not in use, each bombsight was locked inside a safe under armed guard. Before missions, the bombardiers carried them to the aircraft inside padded cases like priests bearing relics. The secrecy was absolute. The Army Air Forces feared that if the device fell into enemy hands, the edge it provided would vanish overnight. But technology alone was not enough. Precision required discipline. At Port Moresby, General George Kenney ordered weeks of intensive training before the B-17s would ever face a real convoy. Bombardiers practiced on floating targets made of oil drums, lashed together their instructors, timing every drop. Early sessions were humiliating. Bombs fell wide, scattered across the water. "We were missing a whole ocean," one bombardier joked bitterly. Yet the crews learned. They adjusted for humidity, for crosswinds, for the way tropical heat distorted air density. They discovered that a single misread gauge could mean a miss by hundreds of feet. Slowly, the math and the muscle began to merge. Inside the aircraft, every role mattered. The pilot had to maintain altitude and heading to within a fraction of a degree. The navigator tracked drift using the stars and a stopwatch. The bombardier synchronized his crosshairs with the moving ship below, calling out corrections: left 10, steady, steady. The crew became a human machine, each man a gear in the mechanism of destruction. When it worked, it was beautiful. When it failed, the ocean swallowed their efforts without a trace. In February 1942, during a test exercise over the Coral Sea, the crews finally saw proof that their efforts were not in vain. A practice bomb fitted with a smoke charge struck within 40 feet of a moving barge. The watching officers erupted in cheers. It was the first time in the Pacific that a high-altitude bomber had come close enough to destroy a ship. The next week, another crew repeated the feat, this time scoring a direct hit. Confidence grew, but so did fear. Every man knew that in real combat the ships would shoot back. To prepare for that reality, the engineers modified the B-17s themselves. They reinforced the bomb bay doors to handle the shock of rapid release. They recalibrated the bomb racks for faster cycling. Some mechanics even adjusted the propeller governors to squeeze an extra few knots of speed during the attack run. These were unofficial modifications, field hacks, born of desperation, but they made the aircraft deadlier and more responsive. The crews nicknamed their planes after women hometowns or jokes: Skull 42, Miss Carrie, Yankee Doodle. Beneath each name was a line of hand-painted bombs marking missions flown, many of them still without combat. The next one, they knew, would be different. General Kenney's belief in engineering bordered on faith. He saw the B-17 not just as a bomber, but as a symbol of American industrial superiority, a weapon of logic against an enemy bound by ritual. To him, every screw in a Norden bomb sight was a declaration that the future belonged to precision. He often said to his officers, "If we can hit a ship at 20,000 feet, we can hit anything." That conviction inspired a generation of airmen who believed that science, not luck, would win the war. Still, there was skepticism. Navy officers doubted the value of high-altitude bombing, insisting that torpedoes were the only way to sink ships. Even within the Army, some argued that the B-17 should stick to strategic targets, factories, cities, airfields, not moving ships. But the Pacific was a laboratory that erased old boundaries. There were no front lines, only endless ocean. If the Americans could not stop Japanese convoys, New Guinea would fall and Australia would be next. The B-17, flawed or not, was the only weapon capable of reaching that far. By late February, the experiment had become necessity. Japanese reinforcements were moving toward Lae, and intelligence reports placed a convoy preparing to depart from Rabaul. The moment Kenny had waited for was coming. He called his senior officers together and laid out the plan. 16 flying fortresses would strike from high altitude at dawn, escorted by weather fronts and surprise. There would be no torpedoes, no dive bombers, no naval guns, only the precision of machines and the courage of their crews. In the last week before the mission, the bombardiers practiced every day, sometimes in storms, sometimes under perfect blue sky. They learned to trust the sight, to feel the rhythm of its spinning gyros, to let numbers replace instinct. One of them, Lieutenant James Doc Leland, wrote in his logbook the night before the mission, "Tomorrow the numbers go to war." The evening before takeoff, the base at Port Moresby was quiet, except for the sound of generators and distant surf. Mechanics worked through the night loading bombs, checking fuses, polishing the glass domes of the Norden sites. In the officers' mess, pilots studied maps by lantern light, tracing the route across the Owen Stanley Range over jungle and sea into enemy airspace. Few spoke. Each knew that the next day would either prove the B-17's worth or expose the dream as a failure. As midnight passed, rain swept across the runway, cooling the air. Somewhere in the darkness, a crewman tightened the last bolt on a bomb rack and patted the metal affectionately. "You'll do fine, girl," he murmured to the aircraft. At 4:30 a.m., the first engines roared to life, shaking the ground. Flames spat from exhaust stacks as the propellers blurred into silver discs. The sound rolled through the camp like thunder. From their tents, men watched the shadows of the bombers stretch across the wet ground. In the control tower, a single light blinked green. One after another, the flying fortresses began to roll down the runway, heavy with fuel and hope. What rose into the sky that morning was not just a squadron, it was an idea made real. For the first time in history, an Air Force believed it could rewrite the laws of naval warfare through calculation alone. The Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting the art of command at sea. The Americans had spent months perfecting the science of striking from above. When those two visions met over the Bismarck Sea, the question would no longer be about courage or numbers. It would be about which nation could adapt faster tradition or technology. As dawn painted the horizon in red and gold, the 16 B-17s leveled off at cruising altitude, their engines humming in synchronized rhythm. In the nose of each aircraft, the Norden bomb sight gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The gyros began to spin, whispering softly, as if alive. Far below, the Japanese convoy moved forward, unaware that the future was already calculating their destruction. The night before the strike, the airfield at Port Moresby lay cloaked in mist. Mechanics worked under dim floodlights, their shadows moving across the aluminum skin of the bombers. Fuel trucks hissed, engines coughed, and the acrid smell of aviation gasoline hung over everything. No one spoke loudly. Every man knew what the morning would bring. For days they had trained for this single moment, 16 bombers, 16 chances, to prove that precision could replace brute force. At 0430 hours, the first B-17 engines cracked through the silence like rolling thunder. One by one, the propellers caught spinning to a blur, filling the tropical air with vibration. Crew chiefs signaled thumbs up as pilots ran their checklists. Hydraulic set. Mixture rich. Flaps, 15. The sky above the Owen Stanley Range was still black stars fading behind a sheet of thin cloud. Captain William Saunders, commanding the lead aircraft, looked out his cockpit window at the row of bombers behind him, their navigation lights blinking red and green like a chain of fire stretching into darkness. At 0510, the control tower's green lamp blinked twice. Takeoff. Saunders eased his throttles forward, feeling the vibration of 4 Wright Cyclone engines shake through the seat into his bones. The plane rolled, gathering speed heavy with fuel, and 10 500-pound bombs slung in the bay. The runway lights blurred. Then the wheels lifted, and the bomber rose into the darkness, the sound of its engines echoing off the mountains. One by one, the others followed, climbing into formation. The climb was brutal. The B-17s lumbered up through rising air currents and thin fog that licked their wings. The Owen Stanleys loomed below black silhouettes of jungle-covered ridges, rising to 10,000 feet. Turbulence jolted the aircraft, tossing coffee mugs and charts through the cockpit. The bombardiers stared through the plexiglass noses, watching lightning flash far to the east. It was a hard route known to pilots as the hump, but it kept them off Japanese radar. At 0700 hours, the bombers cleared the last ridge and leveled out above the Coral Sea. The world below opened into endless blue. In the first light of dawn, the formation spread into combat, spacing 4 squadrons of 4 aircraft 2 miles apart, maintaining radio silence. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of engines and the occasional static from interphone headsets. The crews chewed, gum-checked oxygen lines and tried not to think about what waited ahead. Navigator Lieutenant Frank Tully marked their position with a grease pencil on a paper chart. 100 miles to target zone, he said into the intercom. Saunders nodded. At this altitude, the air was freezing. Frost gathered around the windows and breath fogged inside oxygen masks. Below them, clouds drifted like islands, white and innocent. Somewhere under those clouds was the Japanese convoy steaming toward Leh. At 0815, the radio operator aboard Skull 42 caught a faint signal from a coast watcher stationed near Buna. His voice crackled through static enemy convoy, sighted course 180, speed 8 knots, 8 transports, 4 destroyers. The message repeated twice, then fell silent. Saunders turned to his co-pilot, Lieutenant Don Avery. That's them. The formation altered course 10 degrees east. The pilots trimmed their controls and began a slow descent to attack altitude 25,000 feet. Below, the first shadows of ships appeared through breaks in the clouds, gray shapes moving across a blue mirror. Even at that distance, the wake lines trailing behind each vessel were sharp and bright in the sunlight. Convoy visual, the navigator confirmed. The bombardiers adjusted their bomb sights, aligning crosshairs with the distant columns of smoke rising from the ship's funnels. Through the Norden's lenses, the ocean became a grid of motion and numbers. The gyros spun. Data fed through gears and cams. Altitude speed wind drift each correction, bringing the bomb sight closer to perfect alignment. On the Japanese destroyer, Shirakumo lookouts spotted dark specks glinting high above the sun. Airplanes high altitude, someone shouted. The gunnery officer lifted his binoculars, squinting into the glare. Too high, he muttered, dismissing them. Anti-aircraft crews swiveled their guns anyway, more from habit than alarm. They had seen this before American bombers at extreme height, their bombs falling harmlessly into the sea. But the men in those B-17s were not guessing, they were calculating. In Skull 42, the bombardier Lieutenant Leland leaned forward over the Norden's sight, fingers adjusting the azimuth knob. The ship in his lens, a transport identified as Kembu Maru, slid perfectly into crosshairs. His voice was calm. Steady, steady. Left 5. Hold. The autopilot linked to the bomb site began making tiny corrections, nudging the plane's course automatically. Target locked, Leland said. His thumb hovered over the release toggle. Below, the Japanese ships began their defensive maneuvers. Destroyers increased speed, zigzagging ahead of the transports. Black bursts of flak blossomed far below the bombers, harmless at that altitude, but beautiful in their geometry. The air gunners aboard the B-17s watched through side windows, silent, awed by the sight of anti-aircraft explosions blooming miles beneath them like dark flowers. Bombs away, Leland said. The release clunked through the fuselage. The bomber shuddered slightly as 5 half-ton bombs fell clear. The aircraft lifted suddenly lighter. Through the small window beside him, the navigator saw a chain of black dots tumbling earthward, growing smaller until they disappeared into cloud. He started counting. 1, 2, 3. 38 seconds later, the ocean below erupted. The first bomb struck Kembu Maru directly amidships. The explosion split the vessel in half-flame and water shooting skyward. 2 more bombs landed close to her port side, tearing through her hull. Within seconds, the transport was burning from bow to stern. The destroyer Arashio, maneuvering to assist, turned directly into the path of the falling bombs from another B-17 and took a direct hit near the bridge. Her mast crumpled like wire. The third ship in line, Tamara Maru, tried to turn away, but the shock waves from the detonations rolled her onto her side. From 25,000 feet, the scene looked unreal, like a slow-motion inferno painted on glass. The bombardiers could see flashes of orange reflected off the sea smoke spiraling upward until it reached their altitude. In Skull 42, the waist gunner leaned out his window whispering, "My God, we hit them. We really hit them." Saunders held the bomber steady for a second run, checking his instruments. "Maintain formation," he ordered. "We're going again." Down below, chaos reigned. Japanese gunners fired wildly into the sky, their shells bursting thousands of feet short. Communication lines between ships failed as officers screamed orders, lost in static and fire. Survivors leapt into the water as fuel and oil ignited across the surface, spreading flames faster than the waves could extinguish them. The second wave of B-17s arrived 5 minutes later. They dropped another volley, each bomb guided by the same cold precision. Within 15 minutes, the convoy that had sailed in perfect order was now a cluster of burning wrecks, smoke columns, merging into one dark wall stretching for miles. In his after-action report, Captain Saunders would write only one sentence to describe that moment: the sea looked like it was burning. For the first time in naval history, a high-altitude bombing attack had annihilated a fleet in open water. The Japanese sailors below called it Ten no Tetsu iron from the heavens. To them, it felt like divine punishment. The voice of the narrator slows, almost whispering. For centuries, mankind believed the ocean could not be conquered from the air. On that morning, 16 aircraft proved otherwise. At 09:25 hours, the sky above the Bismarck Sea was a perfect blue, too beautiful for war. Then the horizon cracked open. 16 B-17 flying fortresses emerged from the sunlight silver arcs, gleaming as they swung into attack formation. To the men below, they seemed to appear out of nowhere, silent, massive, untouchable. The Japanese convoy, still steaming south toward Leh, broke its rigid columns as lookouts screamed orders through the smoke and wind. On the destroyer, Arashio Captain Tamotsu Tanemura raised his binoculars and froze. Tiny black dots were falling from the heavens, at first mistaken for debris, then for bombs. His voice cut through the bridge hard to port. The helmsman spun the wheel, but it was too late. The first detonation came without warning, no sound, until after the flash. The deck rose beneath the crew's feet, throwing men against bulkheads. Plates shattered. Metal screamed as the explosion ripped through the forward magazine. In the engine room, fire burst from ruptured fuel lines, sucking the oxygen from the air. Within seconds, the destroyer was engulfed in black smoke. From 25,000 feet above, the B-17 crews saw the plume rising, a thin, perfect column curling into a mushroom. Over the intercom came the calm voice of Lieutenant Leland, bombardier of Skull 42, direct hit. Target neutralized. No one cheered. They were too busy adjusting altitude and setting up for the next pass. Behind Skull 42, the 2nd Element 4 bombers under Captain Frank Tex Morgan rolled into position. Morgan's bombardier had locked onto a transport ship, the Kembu Maru, loaded with nearly 700 soldiers of the 51st Division. Through the Norden sight, the transport filled the crosshairs like a patient under a scalpel. Morgan called over the intercom, "Hold her steady." His co-pilot responded, "Steady as she goes." The bombs fell cleanly, 5 black streaks descending in perfect symmetry. They struck amidships, one penetrating deep into the cargo hold before detonating. The blast tore the ship apart. Steel plates peeled backward like petals, and an orange fireball burst through the smoke. The concussion rolled across the sea, rocking nearby destroyers. Men on neighboring ships felt the heat on their faces even half a mile away. Radio chatter erupted among the B-17 crews, controlled chaos in clipped tones. "Target burning. Shift to secondary. No flak accuracy. They're blind. Watch that crosswind, altitude 250. Over the open frequency, one gunner muttered, "This is for Pearl Harbor." The Japanese gunners tried to fight back. Dozens of 25mm cannons opened fire, filling the air with black puffs. The shells burst thousands of feet below the bombers, useless but defiant. The crews on the Asashio and Shirayuki screamed as falling fragments of their own shrapnel rained down on their decks. At Iro 9:35, the 3rd wave of bombers arrived, 4 aircraft under Captain Saunders himself. They targeted the center of the convoy, where 2 transports were attempting to maneuver side by side, their wakes cutting white arcs through the blue. Saunders looked down through the cockpit window, his hands steady on the throttles. He could see the ships clearly now, each one a dark smear beneath a halo of smoke. "All right, boys," he said softly. "Let's end this." The bombardier called out, target in sight. Crosshairs aligned. The Norden's gyros whirred. For a moment everything seemed to stop, the engines, the wind, even time. Then, bombs away. The bombs dropped in a single clean ripple, each separated by a fraction of a second. As they fell, sunlight flashed off their fins. 40 seconds later, 4 explosions tore through the sea. One bomb hit the Tamara Maru square on her bridge. Another detonated beside her hull, punching a hole below the waterline. Steam hissed from ruptured boilers. The ship began to list men, sliding across the deck into the flames. Aboard Skull were 2. Sergeant McLean, the left waist gunner, watched through his window as the inferno expanded. "Looks like hell opened up," he whispered. His voice was drowned by the roar of engines and the thunder of distant explosions. For the men below, it truly was hell. The Arashio, still burning, drifted uncontrollably into the path of the transport Nojima Maru. The 2 ships collided bow to stern, locking together as fire spread between them. Ammunition began cooking off each detonation, sending glowing fragments across the deck. Some Japanese sailors jumped overboard. Others stayed, trying to man hoses or drag wounded comrades to safety. The sea itself seemed alive, burning with slicks of oil that floated like molten glass. The air smelled of salt and gasoline. Overhead, the bombers circled like indifferent gods preparing for another run. At 0940, the 4th wave came in low, a formation of 4 B-17s that had descended to 17,000 feet for visual confirmation. Their bombardier, Lieutenant Harris, spotted a destroyer zigzagging through debris. "That's our boy," he said. The pilot lined up the run. Flak bursts dotted the sky, but the bombers pressed on. Harris released his payload. One bomb struck just aft of the destroyer's funnel, detonating in the engine room. A second exploded near the stern, snapping the ship's spine. The destroyer broke in 2, both halves sinking within minutes. The water turned black with oil. Life rafts floated among the wreckage, some burning, some overturned. The Japanese sailors who survived clung to debris, their faces gray with shock. They had never imagined that death could fall from such distance with such indifference. By 0950, the entire convoy was disintegrating. Out of 8 transports, 6 were burning or sunk. 2 destroyers were gone, the rest crippled. The sea was littered with bodies and twisted steel. The air shimmered with heat. Smoke rose in thick columns that merged into one dark canopy stretching across the horizon. On board Skull 42, Captain Saunders looked down at the devastation and felt a wave of disbelief. The mission that had begun as an experiment had turned into a massacre. His bombardier, still staring through the sight, murmured, "They never had a chance." Saunders replied quietly, "Neither did the old way of war." As the bombers regrouped and turned south, the radio crackled with scattered voices, all bombs expended. Minimal flak damage, returning to base. The pilots took one last look at the smoking sea before banking toward the clouds. Behind them, the Japanese convoy burned alone, its radio transmissions fading into static. Admiral Kimura, aboard the damaged destroyer Asagumo, stood on the bridge, his uniform covered in soot. The deck was slick with blood and oil. His second officer reported that communications were lost with the transports. Kimura didn't respond. He was staring upward at the distant silver glints moving away into the sun. "Those are bombers," he said softly, as if the word itself had betrayed him. At that height, his communications officer hesitated. "Yes, Admiral?" Kimura lowered his binoculars. The thought came unbidden: if ships could be destroyed like this, from invisible hands above the clouds, then Japan's ocean empire was already doomed. He turned to his staff. "Signal remaining vessels, rescue survivors, then withdraw." His voice was steady, but his eyes were hollow. By 1,000 hours, the last American bombers disappeared beyond the horizon. The thunder of explosions faded, leaving only the hiss of fire on water. The surviving Japanese ships crept through the wreckage, picking up men too burned or wounded to speak. The sea stank of oil and flesh. Gulls circled overhead, their cries mingling with the crackle of flames. Out of 6,900 soldiers aboard the convoy, fewer than 1,500 would ever see land again. Most would perish in the water, victims not of torpedoes or gunfire, but of mathematics, altitude, and precision. At Port Moresby that afternoon, the returning B-17s landed one by one, their wheels touching down on the dirt runway. Ground crews counted the holes in their fuselages, patched shrapnel scars, and refueled for the next mission. Inside the operations tent, General Kenny received the first after-action report. 5 transports confirmed, sunk 2 destroyers destroyed, remainder heavily damaged. He read it twice, then looked up. "They said it couldn't be done," he said quietly. The narrator's voice lower, slow, and deliberate, like the aftershock of thunder. In less than 30 minutes, 16 aircraft had erased an entire convoy. The ocean had become a graveyard, the sky its executioner. The camera of the mind pans upward from the black smoking sea to the silver bombers vanishing into light. The narration continues almost mournful. It was not the power of explosives that shattered Japan's confidence that day. It was the power of precision, the moment when machinery began to think faster than men, and when war itself changed forever. The section closes with silence, broken only by the echo of waves lapping against burning steel. By mid-morning, the Bismarck Sea was quiet once more, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath the smoke and the scattered debris, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a reckoning it had never anticipated. 8 transports were reduced to burning hulks, 4 destroyers crippled or sunk, and thousands of soldiers dead or drifting helplessly in the water. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, surveying the devastation from what remained of Asagumo, realized that the rules of warfare he had relied on for decades were no longer valid. The sea, which had been a realm of Japanese mastery, had been conquered not by superior ships or traditional tactics, but by men and machines operating in precise harmony from 25,000 feet above. The shock to Japanese command was immediate and profound. Reports were rushed to Tokyo. A single squadron of American bombers employing tactics previously considered impractical had destroyed a convoy that was meant to reinforce New Guinea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself was reported to be visibly shaken. For years, the doctrine of the Imperial Navy had emphasized the supremacy of the surface fleet and the limitations of aerial bombing against moving ships. That doctrine now seemed obsolete. Communication channels buzzed with urgent queries. Could these aircraft strike again? What countermeasures were available? The answers were grim. There were few, if any, defenses against precision bombing from high altitude, combined with carefully calculated release mechanisms. At the operational level, the survivors of the convoy struggled with both physical and psychological trauma. The decks of the remaining destroyers were littered with the dead and wounded. Sailors who had manned their guns for years found themselves paralyzed, unable to react to the bombs that had fallen with surgical accuracy. The survivors' testimonies later described the attack as apocalyptic. The sky rained iron. Our ships burned before we could comprehend what hit them. It was as if the heavens themselves had taken sides. Those who had lived through the ordeal carried the memory of sudden, inevitable destruction, a lesson that would haunt them for the remainder of the war. American intelligence analysts understood immediately the significance of what had occurred. The attack was not merely a tactical victory, it represented a strategic revelation. The combination of the Norden bomb site, disciplined crew coordination, and intensive training had created a weapon system capable of bypassing traditional naval defenses entirely. The U.S. Army Air Forces began to conceptualize a new kind of warfare where surface fleets were vulnerable, not just to torpedoes or carriers, but to precision strikes from the sky. The implications for supply lines, reinforcement operations, and Japanese strategic mobility were enormous. The Japanese Navy quickly attempted to reassess their convoy doctrine. Future operations would now have to consider the risk of high-altitude bombers, something previously dismissed as impractical. Convoys would need to sail at night under cloud cover and potentially without visible formations. But even these measures offered limited protection against aircraft equipped with radar and capable of calculating trajectories with deadly precision. The loss of the convoy meant that reinforcements intended for Leh and Salamaua never arrived in time, forcing Japanese ground forces to endure shortages of men, ammunition, and supplies. The strategic consequences rippled beyond the immediate battle-weakening positions across New Guinea and setting the stage for further Allied advances. Within the U.S. forces, the victory confirmed what planners had hoped, but could never be certain of the combination of technological innovation and disciplined training could achieve what sheer numbers alone could not. Commanders documented every detail: bomb release timing, altitude approach angles, evasive patterns of enemy ships. Lessons learned from the Bismarck Sea mission became the blueprint for future operations, influencing strategy across the Southwest Pacific. In essence, a single precise strike demonstrated that industrial ingenuity, when married to tactical expertise, could overcome decades of naval experience. The psychological impact extended far beyond the fleet. Japanese sailors and officers internalized the fact that no ship was safe in daylight within range of American airfields. Confidence in anti-aircraft gunnery, once a source of pride and doctrine, eroded in the face of evidence. Even the most disciplined crews found themselves hesitant, fearful, and uncertain, knowing that mechanical precision from above could defeat them before they had a chance to fight back. This fear multiplied across the fleet, reshaped Japanese naval strategy, constraining movements and forcing reliance on submarines and night operations for transport, a compromise that could not deliver the volume of reinforcements the islands required. The broader strategic consequences were immediate. Allied planners recognized that air power enhanced by precision instrumentation and rigorous crew training could neutralize the threat of Japanese surface fleets without engaging in prolonged naval battles. The cost in human lives and materiel for Japan became disproportionate to the strategic value of their positions. For the United States, it validated the investment in training technology and industrial production proof that numbers alone were insufficient, but paired with precise engineering could overwhelm an experienced opponent. As the sun set over the wreckage, the sea reflected both orange smoke and the fading rays of light. From the vantage of the surviving American bombers returning to base, the operation appeared clean, almost surgical. Each man understood that the destruction of the convoy was not luck, not chance, but the culmination of months of planning, training, and innovation. It was a demonstration of industrial firepower in its purest form, a few machines executing the will of thousands of minds, reshaping the theater of war with mathematical precision. For historians, the Bismarck Sea mission represents a turning point, the day when the assumptions of traditional naval power collided with technological reality. Battleships and destroyers, symbols of centuries of maritime strategy, were revealed to be vulnerable to instruments of calculation and mechanical mastery. The battle demonstrated that mastery of industrial systems and innovation could achieve what courage tactics or experience alone could not. The sky had become more lethal than the sea, and in that realization, the Japanese Navy faced a shock that would reverberate across the Pacific for the remainder of the war. The section closes on a final reflection, the wreckage of the convoy, the smoke rising into a clear morning sky, and the knowledge that precision, preparation, and innovation had forever altered the rules of naval engagement. The battle was over in minutes, but its consequences would shape the strategy, morale, and future of the Pacific theater for years to come. As the smoke over the Bismarck Sea slowly dissipated and the sun climbed higher into the sky, the scale of the destruction became undeniable. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, thousands of troops lost or stranded in the water, and the psychological shattering of the Japanese command underscored a simple yet profound truth: warfare had changed. What had unfolded was not just a tactical victory, it was a strategic revolution. The B-17 flying fortresses had demonstrated with almost mathematical certainty that industrial ingenuity and disciplined execution could annihilate traditional naval power in ways that had once seemed impossible. The implications reached far beyond a single battle, forcing a re-evaluation of doctrine, strategy, and the very assumptions that had guided centuries of naval operations. For the Japanese Navy, the lesson was immediate and painful. Decades of experience, refined gunnery, and the confidence of seasoned sailors could not withstand precise high-altitude bombing combined with meticulous planning. The destruction of the convoy forced commanders to acknowledge that surface fleets were vulnerable in a way they had never considered. Reinforcement operations, previously routine, now carried the risk of catastrophic loss. The Japanese command had to reconsider night movements, dispersal of ships, and reliance on submarines for supply, a compromise that could never match the capacity and efficiency of daylight convoy operations. The Bismarck Sea strike effectively undermined the logistical foundation of Japanese forces in New Guinea, setting in motion a chain of consequences that would affect campaigns across the Southwest Pacific. From the American perspective, the battle validated months of preparation, training, and innovation. Engineers and bombardiers who had labored under harsh conditions, fine-tuning Norden bomb sites, calculating trajectories, and rehearsing for the improbable, witnessed the culmination of their work. It was proof that precision rather than sheer numbers or brute force could achieve decisive results. General George Kenney and his staff had bet on technology method and meticulous planning, and the payoff was total. The Bismarck Sea strike became a model for future operations, influencing not only the Southwest Pacific theater, but also Allied approaches to naval engagement elsewhere. The human element was as crucial as the mechanical. American crews had executed a complex sequence of maneuvers under extreme stress, relying on each other's skill and timing. The bombardier's steady hands, the pilot's precise adjustments, the navigator's constant corrections all converged in a coordinated ballet of destruction. Their success underscored a broader principle. When human skill is amplified by technology, outcomes defy traditional expectations. In the Pacific, this principle reshaped the way wars were fought, emphasizing adaptability, preparation, and the intelligent use of available resources over raw experience alone. Psychologically, the impact on the Japanese Navy was profound. Survivors would recount the shock of witnessing transports and destroyers vaporized from above their gunners and officers rendered helpless. The sense of invulnerability that had characterized Japanese naval operations evaporated in minutes, replaced by fear and uncertainty. This psychological blow had lasting effects on morale, decision-making, and the willingness of commanders to commit surface vessels to contested waters. The Bismarck Sea mission illustrated that technological innovation can have as powerful an effect on the mind as on the physical battlefield, a force multiplier that extends beyond the material. Strategically, the battle signaled a shift in naval doctrine. The age of the battleship and traditional convoy escort was waning. Air power combined with precision targeting and industrial capacity had become the decisive factor. The lessons learned would inform Allied planning for subsequent campaigns from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, highlighting the importance of integrating technology, intelligence, and training into operational strategy. For historians, the Bismarck Sea Strike represents a clear turning point, a demonstration that mastery of machines and mathematics could redefine the conduct of war at sea. The broader lesson for modern warfare is clear adaptation is crucial. The Japanese Navy's reliance on tradition and prior experience left it unprepared for a new form of attack, while American innovation, disciplined execution, and industrial capacity enabled victory against a formidable opponent. The battle exemplifies the value of marrying human skill with mechanical precision, turning careful planning into results that exceed expectations. It is a case study in how ingenuity and preparation can overcome assumptions, complacency, and even superior numbers. For viewers, the Bismarck Sea Strike is more than a historical event. It is a story about the evolution of warfare, the interplay of technology and human capability, and the consequences of failing to adapt. The sky, once a passive backdrop to naval operations, had become a theater of absolute control. The Americans had demonstrated that innovation, when applied with discipline and precision, could achieve what brute force alone could not. It was the triumph of intelligence over habit calculation, over tradition, and foresight over complacency. As the last survivors of the convoy were rescued and the final wrecks sank beneath the waves, one message remained clear: the rules of naval warfare had been rewritten. The Bismarck Sea Strike would not only influence the outcome of the Pacific Campaign, but would resonate as a testament to the power of industrial ingenuity, coordinated human skill, and the relentless application of new ideas in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. In the end, the story of those 16 B-17s is a reminder that in war, as in life, the future belongs to those who adapt, who innovate, and who combine intellect with execution. The Bismarck Sea had been a graveyard for ships, a laboratory for tactics, and a stage upon which the new rules of modern warfare were revealed. September 1943. Over the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the sun shimmered against the silver skin of a lone P-38 Lightning. Its twin engines hummed evenly, cutting through the thin air at 20,000 feet. Inside the cramped cockpit, Major Richard Ira Bong kept his gloved hands steady on the controls. Through the bulletproof windscreen, 12 dark specks appeared against the glare, Japanese Zeros climbing fast, their formation tight and disciplined. Bong didn't panic. He didn't even tense. Instead, he eased the throttle slightly, calculating. From the ground it would have looked like a strange pause in the middle of chaos, a single fighter slowing down as enemies closed in. But inside that cockpit, something entirely different was happening. Bong was running an invisible formula in his mind: airspeed, angle, range, time of bullet travel, the curve of the enemy's climb. For anyone else it would have been guesswork. For him it was instinct, sharpened by thousands of hours of silent observation. He once said, "Don't shoot where they are. Shoot where they will be." He adjusted his sight just off target, leading the Zeros by a fraction of a second. When his thumb pressed the trigger, the Lightning's nose erupted in a short burst of fire. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon spat a cone of destruction that crossed the sky faster than thought. 3 enemy aircraft vanished in orange flashes, their wings sheared off before their pilots even realized what happened. The others broke formation, immediately confused, disoriented. In less than 20 seconds, the sky was empty again. From a distance, it looked like luck. To Bong, it was mathematics, pure invisible precision. That day, he returned to base with half his ammunition still untouched, and a quiet note in his logbook, 3 confirmed. Ammunition expenditure minimal. He never boasted. He simply walked to the maintenance tent, cleaned his guns himself, and checked the convergence settings by hand. The ground crew joked that he treated his P-38 like a violinist tuning an instrument. They didn't realize how true that was. Every angle, every vibration, every delay between trigger and impact mattered to him. To understand Richard Bong, you have to imagine a boy who grew up measuring wind by how the wheat bent in his father's field. He wasn't raised among machines or equations. His classroom was the Wisconsin prairie, his teacher, the flight of migrating geese that cut through the sky in perfect formation. As a child, he built wooden gliders and tested them in the wind, marking how they drifted when thrown at different angles. He didn't call it physics. He just wanted them to fly farther than yesterday. When America entered World War II, Bong's world changed overnight. He enlisted not to fight, but to fly. Yet even in training, instructors noticed something strange. While most cadets fired long, wild bursts at moving targets, Bong fired once short surgical. His bullets always met the target mid-turn, as if he could see half a second into the future. It wasn't magic. It was geometry made human. The deflection angle, the invisible offset between where a target was and where it would be, had become part of his reflexes. That reflex would define his life, and later his legend. In the Pacific, the Japanese Zero was unmatched in low-speed maneuvering. American pilots who tried to dogfight it usually didn't come back. But Bong never tried to turn tighter. He used altitude, speed, and prediction. He learned that a Zero turning left at 300 miles per hour would intersect a bullet path if fired 3 ship lengths ahead and a quarter second early. It was a small, impossible equation solved in real time by a farm boy who barely passed math class. Pilots in his squadron said he seemed to see numbers in the air. When he explained his method, few understood. "You don't chase them," he said. "You meet them halfway." The phrase became his quiet doctrine, passed between pilots like a riddle. Many tried to imitate it, but no one matched his consistency. Where others emptied their guns in panic, Bong squeezed the trigger for a single, measured heartbeat. His gun camera footage became mandatory viewing for new pilots, an unspoken lesson in patience and precision. Historians later called it deflection shooting, but to Bong, it was something simpler, a way to make sense of chaos. "Everything up there moves," he once wrote. "Even when you're still, the wind moves you. The trick is to see where everything will meet, not where it is." That understanding turned every battle into a quiet calculation. When others felt fear, he felt timing. When others prayed, he adjusted angles. And every time he fired, the results seemed impossible. The Japanese called him the ghost of the clouds. Their surviving pilots described attacks so precise that bullets appeared from nowhere. They couldn't understand how an enemy could hit them while they were turning, diving, or climbing. In truth, it wasn't the plane. It was the pilot, an ordinary Midwestern boy who had turned intuition into mathematics. But Bong never saw himself as special. When reporters later asked how he made his impossible shots, he smiled shyly and said, "You just lead a little and hold steady." That understatement defined him. He didn't know he was changing air combat forever. He was simply doing what made sense to him, calculating, adjusting, surviving. The equation in the sky wasn't written on paper. It existed in the narrow space between instinct and intellect, where courage met calculation. And in that space, Richard Bong became something no one expected: the deadliest fighter pilot in American history. Do you believe skill can overcome luck? Type 1 in the comments if you think mastery can be trained, or leave a like if you think some people are simply born with it. Long before Richard Bong ever touched a P-38 Lightning, his world was made of open skies and silent equations written in the movement of wind. He was born on a small dairy farm outside Poplar, Wisconsin in 1920, where the nearest town was a collection of barns and silos surrounded by endless fields. His father worked the land with quiet precision, measuring seasons by the way the snow melted off the fences. His mother taught him patience, insisting that good things only grew when tended carefully. That rhythm, the deliberate pace of rural life, shaped him more than he ever realized. On cold spring mornings, Bong would lie on his back in the grass and watch the geese cross the horizon in perfect formation. He didn't know it yet, but those V-shaped patterns, those turns in spacing, were early lessons in aerodynamics. He learned to predict where each bird would move next, tracing invisible lines across the sky. While other boys threw stones, he threw pebbles ahead of flying crows, testing how far in front he needed to aim. Without realizing it, he was teaching himself deflection, shooting not at the target, but at its future position. At 17, he built his first glider from scrap lumber and the frame of an old barn door. It barely stayed airborne, but it flew long enough for him to feel what he later described as the language of lift. He became obsessed with wind weight and balance. When the windmill near their house groaned, he climbed it and adjusted the vanes until it spun smoothly. His father scolded him for taking risks, but deep down, he admired his son's calmness in the air. In the late 1930s, aviation fever swept across America. Newspapers filled with stories of Lindbergh and Earhart, of daring men and women conquering the sky. For Bong, those stories weren't about fame, they were about freedom. He enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, studying engineering and joining the civilian pilot training program. He washed planes just to afford flying hours. The instructors noticed his natural control. He never yanked the stick or overcorrected. His hands were steady, his eyes calm. One instructor remarked, "He flies like a man watering his crops, steady and patient." When war loomed, Bong enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. His scores weren't the highest, but his flight evaluations were extraordinary. Examiners wrote comments like exceptional spatial judgment and instinctive timing. At Luke Field in Arizona, where the desert sun turned aircraft metal into mirrors, he trained on AT-6 Texans and later on early versions of the P-38 Lightning. It was there that his quiet, methodical nature began to clash with military routine. He didn't like flying by rote instruction. He wanted to understand why a maneuver worked. While other cadets memorized procedures, Bong dissected them. During aerial gunnery training, he noticed that most pilots fired too close, trusting their reflexes instead of anticipating motion. He began sketching triangles on his notebook, the angle between his line of sight, the enemy's path, and the bullet's trajectory. The instructors laughed, calling it farm math. But Bong's scores improved rapidly. He hit moving targets with uncanny regularity. The term deflection shooting wasn't in any manual yet, but he was already living it. He also developed a strange habit, counting seconds aloud under his breath during practice runs. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, fire. It was his way of training his internal clock to match bullet travel time. His timing became so precise that even when turbulence jolted his plane, his bursts landed where they were supposed to. When the gunnery officer checked the results, he thought there was a mistake. Bong's bullet pattern formed a tight cluster at the center of the target silhouette. But Bong wasn't all discipline. Beneath the calm, there was mischief. He loved flying low, too low. On weekends, he would buzz the college campus or chase freight trains across the Arizona desert. Once he flew under a bridge just to see if he could. The Army didn't appreciate his experiments. Reports of unauthorized aerobatics reached command, and disciplinary action followed. To most officers, that would have ended a career. But to General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, it was a sign of something different. "He's reckless," Kenney said, "but he knows exactly what his airplane can do." Kenney had been watching Bong's training records. He saw a pattern few others recognized. The kid never wasted motion, never fired without purpose, and seemed to learn faster than the manual could teach. Instead of grounding him, Kenney transferred Bong to a new assignment combat training for the Pacific Theater. "Let's see if that farm math works when someone's shooting back," the general said with a half smile. Before deployment, Bong wrote a letter home. It was short in his careful handwriting. "Don't worry about me. The air feels right. Everything up there has rhythm just like the fields." His parents kept the letter framed for the rest of their lives. In the spring of 1942, Bong reported to Hamilton Field in California for transition training on the P-38 Lightning. The aircraft looked unlike anything he had ever seen: twin engines, twin tails, tricycle landing gear, and a cockpit suspended between two metal booms. Many pilots found it intimidating, almost alien. Bong fell in love immediately. The twin engines meant redundancy. If one failed, the other could still bring him home. The nose-mounted guns meant no convergence issues. Every bullet met in a single point. To Bong, it wasn't just a plane, it was geometry with wings. He spent hours walking around the aircraft, tracing his fingers along the propellers, memorizing the angles of the ailerons. Mechanics remembered him asking about everything: gun harmonization, fuel mixture ratios, even the minute delay between trigger pull and muzzle flash. He wrote it all down. "Every delay counts," he told one crew chief. "If the plane moves an inch while the bullet leaves the barrel, that's an inch you have to calculate." The crew chief thought he was joking. He wasn't. When Bong finally took, the Lightning airborne instructors watching from the tower saw something rare. He didn't fight the plane's weight. He flowed with it, turning its inertia into stability. He climbed too steeply, stalled once, corrected instantly, and kept climbing. By the time he landed, the instructors knew this quiet farm boy was different. He didn't just fly the P-38, he understood it. Within months, he was bound for New Guinea, a young lieutenant with barely a year of flying experience, heading into a theater where the Japanese Zero ruled the skies. Most men feared the assignment. Bong simply studied maps, airspeeds, and ammunition charts. He wasn't trying to be brave. He was preparing to solve another equation. He closed his notebook, tightened his helmet strap, and looked out across the Pacific for the first time. The horizon stretched endlessly, a line between calm and chaos. Somewhere beyond it waited his first real test, the moment when a farm kid's homemade geometry would meet the war's deadliest pilots. Do you believe precision can be learned from simplicity? Comment 1. If you think discipline can create genius, or like this video, if you believe some instincts are born from childhood. California, 1942. The war had reached every airfield, every classroom, every mind that could hold a map of the Pacific. For the young pilots training at Hamilton Field, the sky was both a dream and a deadline. Among them, Richard Bong had already made a name for himself, not through arrogance or fame, but through something subtler. Everyone knew him as the quiet one who could hit anything that moved. They also knew he had a problem: he loved flying too much. The incident that nearly ended his career started like a dare. Bong had been practicing low-altitude gunnery over the coast when he saw the golden glow of San Francisco Bay in the distance. The temptation was too strong. He dipped the nose of his P-38 Lightning and glided toward the city, skimming the rooftops at less than 300 feet. People on Market Street looked up to see a twin-tailed silver streak slicing through the morning air. Some waved, others dove for cover as the roar of twin Allison engines echoed between buildings. Bong looped once over the Golden Gate Bridge, pulled into a climb, and disappeared toward the clouds. The next morning, his commanding officer didn't see it as a thrill. A formal reprimand was issued within hours. Reckless disregard for regulations, the report said. Endangering civilians, damaging public trust. For most pilots, that would have meant grounding or discharge. When Bong was ordered to report to General George C. Kenney's office, he assumed his career was over. Kenney was not a man easily impressed. He was a strategist known for recognizing talent, but ruthless with mistakes. When Bong stood before him, nervous, silent, cap in hand, Kenney looked him over for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Son, are you trying to kill yourself, or are you just bored?" Bong, embarrassed, murmured that he'd only wanted to test how the plane handled close to the ground. Kenney raised an eyebrow. "And what did you learn?" Bong hesitated. "That it doesn't like to turn below 250 miles per hour, sir." The general smiled slightly. "So you risked your career to learn what the engineers already knew." He paused, leaned forward, and added, "But you felt it. That's the difference." Instead of grounding him, Kenney made an unusual decision. He reassigned Bong to additional advanced flight training and ordered him to fly under observation. "If you're going to break rules," Kenney said, "learn which ones can save your life." Under Kenney's watch, Bong's understanding of flight deepened. He learned that the sky was not chaos, but a system, a set of physical laws that could be read if one paid attention. During mock dogfights, he began studying how enemy pilots would think, not just how they moved. When paired against faster classmates, he didn't try to outturn them. He waited. He watched their rhythm. Then, when they leveled out after a maneuver, he struck. His instructors started calling him the hunter who never hurries. It was also under Kenney that Bong's obsession with geometry became precision. He began keeping a small notebook filled with sketches, triangles of engagement arcs of approach time intervals between sight and fire. Other pilots mocked him for treating combat like algebra, but Kenney saw something more. "That kid's brain runs like a gun sight," he told his staff. "He doesn't just fly the airplane, he measures the war." One afternoon, during a training session, Bong's aircraft camera recorded a sequence that stunned the evaluators. While simulating an interception, he had opened fire at a target drone while pulling a 15-degree turn, something most pilots avoided because centrifugal force distorted aim. Yet his burst hit squarely on the drone's center. The engineers replayed the footage in disbelief. Bong had compensated perfectly for speed distance and bullet fall without any mechanical aid. Kenney had the film kept as an instructional tool for future gunnery officers. Still, Bong wasn't satisfied. "If I can't predict where a plane will be, I shouldn't shoot," he said once after a training flight. His fellow pilots argued that instinct and aggression won fights. Bong disagreed. "Instinct without math is gambling," he said. That philosophy would define every engagement he fought later in the Pacific. Despite his growing reputation, the memory of his punishment stayed with him. He never flew low over cities again. Instead, he poured that same restlessness into perfection. He spent long evenings walking the flight line, examining the bullet paths in sand targets left by the gunnery range. Sometimes he'd lie on his back beside his P-38 and trace patterns in the air, with his finger rehearsing angles of approach against imaginary opponents. When asked why he trained so obsessively, he simply said, "Every second you spend guessing up there is 1 second closer to dying." That realism set him apart. To Bong, war wasn't about glory. It was about control over the machine, over physics, over fear. In late 1942, when orders arrived assigning him to the 49th Fighter Group in New Guinea, Kenney personally approved the transfer. Before Bong left, the general shook his hand and said, "You've got something rare, son. You make flying look like thinking. Don't lose that." The other pilots envied his promotion, but also respected it. They'd seen him turn punishment into discipline, arrogance into precision. His former instructor summed it up best. He learned the rule every great pilot learns too late, that the sky forgives no impulse, only preparation. As Bong boarded the transport plane heading west, he glanced back once at the airfield where he had nearly ruined his career. In his logbook, under the date, he wrote one line, "Every mistake costs less if you learn the math behind it." That lesson would follow him across the Pacific and into legend. The reckless farm boy who once skimmed rooftops over San Francisco was now a man who measured the distance between life and death in fractions of a second. Do you believe failure teaches more than success? Type 1 in the comments if you agree or like this video. If you believe some people only learn by surviving their mistakes. New Guinea, 1943. The jungle stretched endlessly beneath the clouds, a sea of green broken only by silver rivers that gleamed like knives under the sun. Above it all, American bombers crawled across the sky in tight formation, heading for Japanese supply depots hidden along the coast. Flying high above them, Richard Bong scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning. His oxygen mask muffled his breath, the gauge needles steady. Nothing moved until a voice crackled through the radio. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." Tiny black specks appeared against the distant blue, growing larger by the second. Zeros, fast, agile, deadly in a turn. Bong's mind began working long before his hands did. He was already calculating distance closure rate angle of attack. The bombers were climbing at 180 miles per hour. The Japanese fighters were approaching from 25 degrees above, closing at 350. He didn't need radar or a computer. He had something better, a sense of geometry so refined it bordered on clairvoyance. "Lightning 1, engage," came the order. Bong pushed the throttles forward. Twin Allisons roared as the P-38 surged ahead. His altimeter dropped. He wasn't chasing the enemy, he was setting up the equation. To most pilots, air combat was chaos, flashing wings, streaks of tracers, split-second reactions. But to Bong, it was an organized storm with patterns hidden beneath the noise. Every attack followed a shape, every escape a line. Somewhere inside that storm was the perfect intersection point, the place where his bullets would meet his target at exactly the right time. He called it the triangle. The first side was his flight path. The second, the enemy's trajectory. The third, the invisible path of his bullets through the air. When those three lines met, the sky burned. Bong rolled inverted and dove through the formation of bombers, leveling out just below the clouds. The Zeros were diving now, their bright red circles flashing in the sunlight as they aligned for attack. Bong waited until they began their run, until their angle locked. Then he pulled up at a shallow climb, 30 degrees, just enough to place himself on their blind side. His hands didn't tremble. He lined the lead Zero, not in the center of his gun sight, but slightly ahead of it. He fired a 1-second burst. 5 guns flared in perfect unison. The stream of tracers curved gently across the sky, meeting the Zero mid-turn. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in a flash of orange and smoke. Bong didn't cheer. He adjusted, shifted his aim, fired again. Another burst, another explosion. His wingman later said it looked impossible, like he was painting the air with bullets. In truth, Bong wasn't reacting, he was predicting. He knew that at 300 yards, a 50 caliber bullet from a P-38 took about 1/3 of a second to reach its target. At a combined closing speed of nearly 500 miles per hour, that meant the target would move 75 yards in that same moment. So Bong aimed exactly 75 yards ahead. It was pure trigonometry performed instinctively. The Japanese formation broke apart. Bong climbed hard, then rolled over into a diving turn, using gravity as his ally. A Zero appeared in his mirrors, its nose flashing as cannon shells streaked past his wingtip. Bong banked sharply, feeling the G-forces crush his chest. His voice was calm when he radioed, "I see him." Then, instead of trying to outturn the nimble Zero, he pushed the yoke forward and dropped straight into a power dive. The Lightning screamed past 400 miles per hour. The pursuing Zero followed, but too late realized the trap. The Japanese aircraft couldn't handle such speed. Its control surfaces stiffened, the nose trembling violently. Bong waited until the gap closed to 400 yards, then pulled up in a smooth arc. The Zero shot through the point where he had been seconds before, right into his crosshairs. Another short burst, another kill. By the time the engagement ended, 4 Japanese fighters were down. Bong's ammunition counters showed fewer than 200 rounds spent, barely a fraction of his load. The other American pilots returned with empty guns, their bursts fired in desperation. Bong's combat film told a different story. Each burst lasted less than 2 seconds, every shot deliberate. That night, the debriefing officers reviewed the footage in silence. One finally spoke. "He doesn't fight them," he said. "He calculates them." Word spread quickly through the 5th Air Force. The Triangle of Death, as other pilots began calling it, wasn't just luck, it was a method. Bong explained it in simple terms. Every plane up there is moving in 3 dimensions. You can't shoot where he is. You have to shoot where your bullet and his path will cross. That means thinking ahead just a blink faster than him. Instructors started using his gun camera film for gunnery training. They played the clips frame by frame, trying to understand how a farm boy had turned a deadly art into science. Bong never wrote a formula. He didn't need to. It lived in his muscles, in his timing, in the quiet focus that defined him. On the front lines, the results were devastating. Between June and November 1943, Bong achieved 21 confirmed kills. His accuracy rate was more than 5 times that of an average American fighter pilot. Statistical analysis after the war revealed his hit probability was nearly 23%, an almost impossible figure for air combat at the time. He wasn't faster or stronger. He was simply precise. The Japanese eventually learned to fear the twin-tailed silhouette that appeared from above the clouds. Pilots who survived engagements described the same terrifying experience. He fires once, and you vanish. One Japanese ace reportedly told his squadron, "If you see a P-38 with the name Marge on its nose, break away immediately." Despite the growing legend, Bong remained detached from the myth. When ground crews congratulated him after missions, he smiled politely and went back to cleaning his guns. He adjusted their convergence distance again and again, narrowing it from 400 yards to 275, his personal sweet spot. When asked why, he replied, "Because at 275 yards, I can see the future." In reality, he wasn't boasting. He was describing the margin of predictability he had built for himself, a space where mathematics met instinct and death moved too slowly to catch him. As his victories mounted, the numbers told a larger story. American intelligence reported a noticeable drop in Japanese morale in the region. Intercepted radio messages revealed confusion and fear among Zero pilots. Enemy twin-engine fighter impossible accuracy, 1 transmission read. No escape when attacked from above. Bong's triangle was no longer a personal trick. It was changing the psychology of the war in the air. Late one evening after his 21st confirmed kill, Bong sat beside his aircraft as mechanics patched bullet holes along the wing. He watched them silently, the tropical air thick with fuel fumes. His crew chief asked how he always stayed so calm. Bong smiled faintly. "Because up there, panic is just bad math." The remark became famous among his squadron. It summed up everything about him: the quiet humor, the logic under pressure, the ability to see numbers where others saw chaos. In the months that followed, his triangle of death became standard doctrine. Pilots practiced leading targets, timing bursts, and converting altitude into energy, just as he did. The farm boy from Wisconsin had turned air combat into a science of precision. But even as his legend grew, Bong refused to see himself as anything more than a man solving problems in the sky. "I just try to be where I need to be," he said in one of his few interviews. What he didn't say, but every pilot who flew beside him knew, was that his calculations had become something larger than survival. They had become art. Do you think war rewards intelligence or instinct? Comment 1 if you believe calculation saves lives, or like this video if you think courage alone decides who survives. July 1943. Above the jungles of Lae, New Guinea, the air shimmered with heat and distance. From 20,000 feet, the world below looked peaceful rivers like threads of silver mountains blurred by mist. But every pilot in the 9th Fighter Squadron knew the truth somewhere beneath those clouds. Death waited with red suns painted on its wings. That morning, the mission was simple on paper. Escort a flight of B-25 bombers toward enemy supply convoys near the coast, then return before fuel ran low. But in war, simple was a word that disappeared fast. Bong led the second element of Lightning fighters climbing steadily into the sun. His aircraft P-38J Marge was trimmed perfectly, fuel-balanced guns harmonized to his favorite 275-yard convergence. He had flown hundreds of hours in her. She was no longer a machine. She was an extension of thought. Halfway to target, the radio crackled. Bandits. Multiple. 11 o'clock high. The voice of the lead escort came through strained with static. Bong squinted into the glare and saw them 12-0 sunlight flashing off their rounded wings as they dove from altitude in perfect formation. He counted them automatically, then smiled faintly. 12, he murmured. That's fair. The escort leader ordered the bombers to tighten formation and dive for cloud cover. Bong and his wingman broke upward trying to gain altitude advantage. But in seconds, tracer lines stitched the sky. The Japanese were fast diving with gravity's full blessing. One lightning burst into flame, spiraling downward in a trail of black smoke, the radio filled with overlapping shouts. I'm hit, breaking left. They're all over us. Amid the chaos, Bong's voice was calm. Stay with me. Keep your speed. He rolled inverted, diving hard toward the jungle canopy. The sudden drop slammed his body against the harness. His vision tunneled. The altimeter spun. His wingman followed for a moment, then broke away, chased by 2 zeros. In less than 30 seconds, Bong was alone. 12 against 1. He leveled out at 5,000 feet, the air dense and trembling with heat. The zeros fanned out above him, circling like vultures. They thought they had him trapped. Bong throttled back slightly, letting them believe it. All right, he whispered. Let's do the math. The first zero came from the right, diving at full throttle. Bong didn't turn. Instead, he eased into a shallow climb, keeping the enemy in his peripheral vision. At the last second, he pulled a high G roll and cut across the attacker's path. His guns flashed once 2 short bursts. The zero exploded mid-air, fragments scattering like burning leaves. 11 left. He climbed sharply using the P-38's raw horsepower to regain altitude. The Lightning's twin turbochargers screamed. 2 zeros followed, climbing in spiral formation. Bong waited until their turns widened, then rolled into a dive. His closure rate was enormous, over 500 miles per hour combined. He fired only once a half-second burst. The tracers formed a single glowing line that met the nearest zero head-on. The impact was instantaneous. Fire, debris, then silence. The second zero panicked, braking too hard. Bong pulled up into a vertical climb, rolled over the top, and came down on the enemy's tail. Another burst, another kill, 10 left. The radio was quiet now. No voices, just the steady breathing inside his oxygen mask and the rhythmic hum of the engines. He could almost hear his own heart sinking with the propellers. More shapes appeared behind him, 3 zeros coming fast. He banked left dove low into a valley, the trees flashing beneath his wings. The P-38's heavy frame shuddered in the thin air. One mistake, one branch, and it would all be over. But Bong didn't flinch. He dropped to treetop height, using the terrain to mask his movements. The zeros followed too eagerly. He pulled up suddenly at the end of the valley, climbing through a cloud bank. The Japanese pilots lost visual contact for a split second. That was all he needed. He rolled hard, right-flipped the plane inverted, and dove behind them. The first Zero filled his gun sight. A single burst tore it apart. The second tried to climb, exposing its belly. Bong's cannon roared again. The plane disintegrated. The third, realizing the trap, tried to escape downward. Bong didn't chase. He anticipated. He adjusted angle and fired into empty air. The fleeing Zero flew straight into his bullets. 7 left. Minutes passed, though. It felt like hours. Sweat rolled down his back despite the freezing altitude. He checked his ammunition, less than half remaining, fuel at 60%. He couldn't fight them all forever. But he could control the geometry. He climbed back into the sun using its glare as a shield. The remaining Zeros regrouped below, circling cautiously. They couldn't see him now. Bong leveled out, aimed his nose slightly ahead of their formation, and waited. When he pressed the trigger, 5 streams of fire lanced downward. 2 Zeros vanished in twin blossoms of flame. The survivors scattered, firing blindly into the glare. 5 left. A sharp thud jolted his aircraft. The left wing vibrated violently. He had been hit. 20mm cannon shells punched holes through the aluminum skin. Warning lights flickered. The left engine coughed but held. Bong feathered the propeller slightly, compensating for drag. No panic, just adjustment. Another Zero appeared from below, rising fast to finish him. Bong rolled right inverted and dropped behind it in a split S maneuver. His bullets ripped through its fuselage. The explosion rocked his plane, peppering the canopy with debris. 4 left. The next attack came from above, a coordinated strike, 2 Zeros diving, while 2 approached head-on. Bong pulled into a steep climb, feigning retreat. As they followed, he cut power and rolled sharply. The attackers overshot their momentum, carrying them forward. Bong fired into their exposed undersides. One caught fire instantly. The other lost control and spiraled into the jungle. 2 left. Fuel low. Ammo low. The battle had lasted nearly 15 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. Bong turned north, hoping to regroup with his squadron. But the last 2 Zeros stayed on him like shadows. They were disciplined, cautious, learning from the deaths of their comrades. Bong climbed higher, pretending weakness. The Zeros followed, pressing the advantage. At 18,000 feet, he suddenly nosed over into a dive so steep it felt like falling through gravity itself. The P-38 screamed past 450 miles per hour, the wind howling. The Zeros tried to follow, but their lighter frames began to shake violently. Bong pulled out of the dive at 6,000 feet. The enemy couldn't. One broke apart mid-air. The other, realizing its fate, leveled off too late. Bong turned smoothly, aimed, and fired one final burst. The last Zero vanished into flame. The sky was empty. For a moment there was nothing, no radio, no movement, no sound, but the twin heartbeat of his engines. Bong exhaled slowly, his vision blurred by exhaustion. He checked his gauge's fuel, nearly gone, left engine leaking oil. He was 200 miles from base. He climbed to conserve energy, throttled back, and turned for home. When he landed hours later, the mechanics counted 6 bullet holes across the wings and fuselage. His gun barrels were still warm, his ammunition drums nearly half full. He stepped out of the cockpit, face pale but calm. "You were outnumbered 12-1, his crew chief said. "How many did you get?" Bong thought for a moment. 5, he said simply. Maybe 6. The official count later confirmed 5 kills, 1 probable. He had survived one of the most uneven dogfights of the war without serious damage, and his fuel records showed he had landed with less than 10 minutes of reserve left. That night, as the squadron gathered around him, Bong didn't tell stories. He sat quietly cleaning his gun barrels, as always. When a fellow pilot asked how he'd done it, Bong answered in his usual plain voice, "They turned where I told them to." It was not arrogance, it was geometry. Do you believe calm thinking beats raw aggression? Type 1 in the comments if you think precision saves more lives than bravery, or like this video if you believe courage still wins the day. By late 1944, the name Richard Ira Bong had become legend. In mess halls and on airfields across the Pacific, pilots spoke his name with a mix of reverence and disbelief. 40 confirmed victories, more than 200 combat missions. not once shot down. The farm boy from Wisconsin had become America's ace of aces, the man who had outflown, outthought, and outlasted the best Japan could offer. But the fame that followed him home was something he never wanted. When General George Kenney recalled him to the United States, Bong protested. "Sir," he said, "I'm just doing my job." Kenney replied gently, "That's exactly why we can't afford to lose you." Washington needed a hero. America needed a symbol of mastery in the air. So they sent Bong on a national tour to sell war bonds. He stood on stages under bright lights, shaking hands with admirals and schoolchildren. Newspapers called him the gentleman ace, the quiet killer who smiled like a teacher. People expected stories of courage and violence. He gave them humility instead. When asked how he shot down 40 planes, Bong answered, "I just lead them a little more than most folks." The crowd laughed, thinking it modesty. His squadron knew it was the truth. But even as he smiled for cameras, something inside him felt unfinished. War had defined his world for 3 years, and without it, silence felt unnatural. The skies he had once mastered now belonged to someone else. The P-38 lightning his partner through every battle was being replaced by something new, sleeker, faster, dangerous, in a different way. The jet age had begun. In early 1945, Lockheed engineers invited Bong to test America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. It was a machine unlike anything before it, a single turbojet engine, instead of propellers, streamlined wings, a cockpit that could touch speeds over 500 miles per hour. For Bong, it was irresistible. "If this is the future," he said, "I want to meet it first." He married his longtime sweetheart Marjorie in February. For the first time in years, he spoke about the future. After this, he told friends, "I'll come home, teach flying, maybe raise kids who'll never have to go to war." But destiny had other plans. August 6, 1945, Burbank, California. The morning was bright, the air heavy with the scent of oil and metal. Major Bong climbed into the cockpit of P-80 serial number 4485048 for an acceptance test flight. It was supposed to be routine, a quick evaluation before delivery. He strapped in, checked the gauges, and gave a thumbs up to the ground crew. The jet's engine whined, then roared to life, exhaling blue flame. For the first time, he felt thrust instead of torque. It was smooth, endless power. At 10:30 a.m., he rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky. Witnesses said the takeoff was flawless, steady, graceful. But seconds later, at only 700 feet, something went wrong. A fuel pump malfunctioned. The jet's single engine sputtered, then flamed out completely. Silence. Bong tried to restart. He followed the checklist perfectly, but there wasn't time. The altitude was too low, the speed too slow. He aimed for a nearby field, fighting the controls as the ground rushed upward. In the final moments, he attempted to eject, but the seat jammed. The P-80 struck the earth and exploded in a plume of black smoke. The shockwave shattered nearby windows. By the time rescue crews arrived, there was nothing left but twisted metal and the unmistakable smell of burned fuel. America's greatest fighter pilot was gone. He was 24 years old. The same day, halfway across the Pacific, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima. The explosion flattened an entire city. The news eclipsed everything else. Newspapers barely mentioned Bong's death, buried under headlines announcing the dawn of the atomic age. The world had entered a new kind of war, one fought not by men in cockpits, but by machines of annihilation. Those who knew him felt the irony deeply. The man who had perfected human precision died the very day machines made it obsolete. His death marked the passing of an era, the end of the age of sight and calculation, and the beginning of the age of power beyond control. General Kenney wept when he heard the news. "The kid could outfly death for 3 years," he said quietly, and it still found him on a sunny morning in California. At his funeral in Poplar, the skies were clear. Hundreds gathered pilots, mechanics, farmers, children, watching as a formation of P-38s roared overhead, one breaking away to symbolize the fallen. Marge stood beneath the sound of those engines, tears tracing silent paths across her face. On the nose of the lead P-38, someone had painted her name, just as Bong had done years before in New Guinea. In the months that followed, his story faded beneath the noise of victory parades and atomic headlines. Yet among pilots, his legend grew. Every airman who fired a burst into an invisible future owed something to the quiet kid who once measured angles in his father's wheat field. Richard Bong never saw the new world he helped build. But in every fighter pilot who trusts calculation over chaos, who waits one breath longer before firing, his ghost still flies. Do you believe destiny chooses its own ending? Comment 1 if you think fate always finds its way, or like this video if you believe we write our own final chapter. The war ended weeks after Richard Bong's death. Across the Pacific, the skies that had once thundered with engines fell silent. The jungles of New Guinea grew over the wreckage of shattered planes. Steel rusted, stories blurred. Yet one record refused to fade: 40 confirmed victories, an achievement no American pilot has ever surpassed. But Bong's real legacy wasn't measured in numbers. It lived in how he changed the art of flying itself. Before him, aerial combat was often ruled by instinct, by raw aggression. Pilots pulled the trigger when they felt the moment was right, trusting adrenaline more than analysis. Bong replaced that chaos with something colder and more exact. He turned emotion into geometry, fear into rhythm, and made calculation beautiful. In 1946, at a small airfield in Wisconsin, the Army Air Forces dedicated the Richard I Bong Memorial Field. His parents stood quietly beside a restored P-38 Lightning, painted in the same silver and green pattern as his own. On the nose, in looping script, was the name Marge. For a long moment his mother stared at it, her hand resting on the cool metal. "He loved this plane," she whispered. It listened to him. The memorial became a museum years later, housing Bong's flight logs, his Medal of Honor, and reels of the gun camera footage that made him a legend. The film was studied by generations of pilots. Frame by frame, they watched the same truth repeat itself. Short bursts, perfect lead angles, no wasted motion. His hit rate became the standard for all fighter training. Every modern manual on aerial gunnery still carries a version of Bong's deflection principles: how to predict motion, how to read energy, how to shoot, not at the target but at time itself. Historians called him the last of the intuitive aces, the man who bridged the gap between human instinct and machine precision. Engineers studied his combat reports to understand what made his technique reproducible. They found that his average deflection angle, 1.8 degrees at 300 yards, matched the optimal intercept curve calculated years later by computer simulation. Without equations, without instruments, he had reached perfection through feel alone. For Bong, flying was never about dominance. It was about discipline. He wrote once in a letter, "A plane doesn't forgive guessing. You have to understand it before it understands you." Those words would outlive him. In pilot schools across the United States, instructors began teaching that very philosophy: mastery through comprehension, not through force. But the greatest proof of his influence came not from Americans, but from his former enemies. In the 1950s, interviews with surviving Japanese pilots revealed how deeply he had affected them. One recalled, "We could hear his bullets before we saw him. They came from the side, from nowhere. He never wasted a shot. It was like fighting a ghost who already knew where you would die." Even in peacetime, Bong's presence lingered wherever the sound of an engine echoed. The Air Force named its highest award for excellence in aviation, the Richard Bong Achievement Trophy. Pilots competing for it weren't judged by kills or speed, but by accuracy, control, and decision-making, the qualities that had defined him. And yet, beyond all the trophies and analysis, what people remembered most was his quiet humility. In every interview, every letter home, Bong refused to call himself a hero. Heroes, he once said, are the ones who didn't come back. To his ground crew, he was just Dick, the kid who helped carry ammunition boxes and cleaned his own guns after missions. To his fellow pilots, he was proof that calm could be deadlier than rage. General Kenny, years after the war, wrote in his memoirs, "Bong made killing look like thinking." But he wasn't a killer. He was a craftsman. His art was precision. That description would become the essence of his story. He didn't win through strength or luck or technology. He won through patience, the rarest weapon of all. As jet fighters replaced propellers and computers replaced gun sights, Bong's methods seemed obsolete. Yet even in the digital age, his lessons endure. Modern fighter pilots using radar-guided missiles still practice lead pursuit, a direct descendant of his deflection shooting. The equations their systems use are the same invisible math Bong once solved by instinct. The sky may have changed, but the logic behind survival never did. At the Richard Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, visitors can stand beside a restored P-38 Lightning identical to the one he flew. Its metal gleams softly under museum lights, the twin booms stretching outward like silver wings caught mid-flight. In a glass case nearby rests his Medal of Honor, its ribbon faded but unbowed. Next to it, a small notebook filled with his handwriting, neat, deliberate lines of angles, distances, and notes on lead and fire time. On one of the last pages, written in pencil smudged by sweat, he had scribbled a single sentence, "Every bullet has its own truth. Find it before it finds you." Those words could have been about more than air combat. They captured a philosophy of life itself, the idea that control, understanding, and timing matter more than passion alone, that perfection isn't born, it's practiced, that even in war knowledge can be an act of mercy. Today, when young pilots ask instructors who Richard Bong was, the answer rarely includes the full list of victories. Instead, they hear something simpler. He's the reason we still believe precision can save lives. The farm boy from Wisconsin never lived to see the world at peace. But in the quiet between takeoff and combat, between fear and calculation, his spirit remains a steady voice reminding those who fly that discipline, not glory, defines greatness. The sky has changed, but his equation still holds. Do you believe mastery can outlive its master? Comment 1 if you think true skill never dies, or like this video if you believe heroes live on through those they teach.